Good afternoon, everyone. Am I audible? Lovely. Let me take this opportunity to welcome you all to today's session. And I'd like to welcome everybody here present with us and those that will be joining us online. And in a special way, let me recognize the presence of our Director General, Dr. Ngozi. Thank you for being here. Thank you so much for taking time to come and be part of this important conversation where we talk about domestic policies or market access. What is most critical to unlock new trade opportunities? My name is Princess Puskes. I'm a senior economist in the Modeling and Forecasting Unit in the Research and Financial Stability Department at the Central Bank of Botswana. I have been with the bank for over 12 years, working on implementing and formulating monetary policy. I am also a member of the Young African Trade Experts Fellowship, and my journey started by attending the first public forum ever in 2022. I've been here for the third time in a row, started with asking a question, just a question. I remember the other day, Dr. Ngozi said to me, "You see the benefits of asking a smart question, young girl?" So that and being a trade expert member has opened so much opportunities for me in the field of trade. Now, I'm going to go on and introduce my panelists here, my esteemed speakers. To my right, I have Ms. Nonye Ayeni from the Nigerian Export Promotion Council. Nonye is a key figure in reshaping Nigeria's non-oil export sector and instrumental in steering the diversification of Nigeria's export landscape. Welcome, my lady. Then next I have Mr. Sumanta Chowdhury, and I'm honored to welcome you here. He's an international trade specialist with 20 years of experience and a distinguished career as a civil servant. He currently serves as the principal advisor on international trade policy at the Confederation of Indian Industry, the Apex Industry Chamber. I am delighted to introduce David Look, Professor David Look, a professor in practice, strategic director at Firoz Lalji Institute for Africa at London School of Economics, where he oversees a new program in African trade and specializes in African trade policy and trade negotiations. I have the pleasure of introducing Viviana Ribeiro, Executive Director of the Export Investment Center of the Dominican Republic, where she promotes the development of the export sector and attraction of investment with unparalleled records for the Dominican Republic. Under her leadership, the Center of the Export and Investment for the Dominican Republic recorded a record-breaking performance of the country's exports early this year in January, with exports totaling an impressive of 847.8 million, marking the highest export volume for any January in the history of Pro-Dominica. Lastly, I'm pleased to welcome Tanya Tefenua, a principal of the Tefenua Law and Consulting, a firm that provides legal and educational services to enhance the Maori social and economic development. She's a passionate educator, practice solicitor, specializing in Maori commercial law in New Zealand. She also serves as a member of the Civil Advisory Board of the Director General Office. Whew, yeah, I have experts with me right here. Now, with such a wealth of expertise of my panel, I believe I'm perfectly positioned to discuss whether market policies or market access or domestic policies, which one is critical to unlock trade opportunities. Now, before we start that, I'll just give a broad overview on market access and get to say that it is important for enabling businesses to enter new markets, sell their products, and expand their customer base. It involves reducing trade barriers such as tariffs, quotas, regulatory hurdles, which can significantly lower the cost of exporting goods and services. Enhanced market access allow firms to compete more effectively on the global scale, fostering economic growth and innovation. The World Bank research indicates that developing countries, each day of delay in the export process due to excessive documentation can lead to a reduction in trade by approximately 1%. Furthermore, additional trade costs incurred by this documentation requirements can be equivalent to tariffs of about 5% to 25%. And this impact is particularly significant for time-sensitive goods, especially in the agricultural sector. On the other hand, we have effective domestic policies, which are equally important in creating a supportive environment for trade. Poor trade policies can lead to significant trade costs, which have become a major barrier to accessing global markets, thereby hindering export growth. Studies show that African businesses face trade costs that are approximately 20 to 30% higher than they would if policies were effective. Furthermore, research suggests that reducing these trade costs through policy reforms could boost Africa's GDP, by 1 to 3% annually. Now, this underscores the urgent need for policy reforms aimed at reducing trade costs, which would enhance Africa's integration into the global markets and unlock substantial economic benefits, including increased trade and overall economic growth. Now, with that said, and with that overview in mind, I will turn over to my panelists for their perspective on today's topic, and I will start with Sumantha. Please give us what your view is on today's topic.
Thank you, Princess, and let me again thank the WTO for inviting me to this panel on a very exciting topic of market access versus domestic policies. I think to begin with, it's important to put this in some kind of a context, and I'll very briefly try and do this as to why perhaps this debate has become even more important because of certain trends that are there. One, of course, is we've all been faced with a lot of uncertainties in global trade over the past few, at least a decade and all. And increasingly, this has sort of brought about vulnerabilities either in supply chains, in logistic bottlenecks, and so on. And this has led to a certain change in both the production patterns and the need for supply chain resilience, diversification, etc. So this is one trend which has been fairly dominating for a variety of reasons. A second, of course, has been in terms of disruptive technologies, and disruptive not in a negative sense, but technologies which have again changed the way production and trade are evolving and have been done. And therefore, you've sort of had a lot of changes in terms of both traditional comparative advantages, in terms of adaptability, and so on. A third factor, I think, which is very, very critical is the whole issue about the imperatives of climate change and climate mitigation, which have its own consequences both on trade and, of course, on domestic policy. So you have the need for energy transition, particularly so in countries which have traditionally been dependent on maybe more sort of less environmental friendly sources of power. You have, for example, the huge revolution in the auto sector with the EV and the hybrids coming in. Now, this has also led to a whole different chain, starting from critical raw materials, batteries, and so on. And therefore, again, the landscape has changed. One final point is that there has, of course, also been, and this is, of course, something that's been happening for quite some time, unfortunately, increasing inequalities and to some extent, therefore, some kind of backlash as well against globalization and all this. So all this together, I think, if one puts in perspective, this has led to changes in the way I think countries are looking at market access and are looking at domestic policies. And let me briefly come to a few of them. The first, of course, is that today's world, you hear a lot more about partnerships, collaborations. You have a whole new, for example, architecture, perhaps not a full-blown trade agreement, like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which talks about supply chain. There's a whole supply chain pillar, which is really looking at critical sectors and key goods and how countries can partner and collaborate, whether it's in technology, whether it's in better use of critical minerals, in terms of investments in each other's countries, and so on. So therefore, in that sense, there is a need and a demand for a more collaborative relationship between these areas. A second factor, of course, is in some sense because of the result of huge revolutions or transformations that are required in energy, in other areas, in auto, there are a host of supporting domestic policies to support and encourage both the private sector, the public bodies, and even the consumers to get into this ecosystem and work it out. So this has, again, its own consequences in terms of, I would say, to some return, once again, of the importance of local content. And this we know is something, of course, that has disciplines, but there is, of course, this sort of, and it's good to recognize that there is this increasing use, in some sense, of some form of domestic content. The other, of course, is that in terms of relationships, investment and trade integration has been happening much better. Investments are now used, for example, not only as simply as an FDI, but also as a supportive measure for the domestic industry to develop, to gain new technology, to gain new business practices, and so on. So there is, therefore, all these imperatives of domestic policy that have come in. And on the other side, certainly market access remains important because countries do need to find both new markets, perhaps penetrate existing markets better, get into newer products, and largely now it's certainly not just goods, it's increasingly more and more of services and more of digitalization. And this has brought about also a different ecosystem of domestic policies which support digital trade. And increasingly also we find that a large part of trade flows come from the global and regional value chains. And there, market access, trade agreements, preferential trade agreements play a very important role, both in terms of imports and exports, and also in terms of investments. And this interface, I think, is only going to become perhaps stronger as we go along. So in nutshell, I think it's these two are absolutely complementary. They need to be mutually supportive, and they need largely to go in a direction which, of course, there will be certain gaps between what you might be able to do domestically and what you might be able to do in international forums. But the general direction has to be perhaps consistent with each other, and only then perhaps they will be mutually supportive.
Right. Thank you so much, Sumanta, for such an informative overview. I remember Dr. Ngozi the other day mentioned the importance of having supply chains. And when you mentioned partnership and collaboration, that you find most African countries, for example, having critical minerals, but then the problem is we just extract them. take them out to maybe developed countries for processing, and when they come back, they're more expensive. So there's also need to nurture our industries. And I've also picked the importance of diversification and that from the commodity producing countries and digitalization. Thank you so much. We now move on to Ms. Nonye. Please share with us what you have for us.
Good day, everyone. Thank you, Princess.
Your mic, my lady.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good day, everyone. Thank you, Princess. And my special thanks to the DJ, Dr. Ngozi, my panelists, my fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen. I think this is a privilege for me and an honor to be here. And I'd like to thank WTO for this platform. The topic today is an interesting one indeed. More than ever before, all countries are now very much integrated, thereby making the world a global village. We also are aware that resources are not equally distributed amongst nations. And you find out that because they are not equally distributed, different countries are looking for ways to improve trade and also to develop their economies. Again, there are restrictions. There are technical barriers and non-technical barriers that actually hinder this trade enhancement. And WTO has been preaching against restrictions. They believe that trade should be seamless, should be simple, less cumbersome, and without restrictions. Because these restrictions actually hinder trade. It hinders market access. Having said that, market access, as we all know, borders on allowing goods and services to have to enter into different countries. It's also about international regulations, breaking the barriers, and those barriers include tariffs and non-tariff barriers, also complex custom procedures and documentations, and some complicated regulations in different countries. It also borders on standards and quality, the goods and the services that are going to countries. What's the standard? The standard, do they align with international standard? Then it also borders on sanitary and phytosanitary issues. And then when you look at all these factors are also basically the same thing, the same factors that domestic policies represent. The only difference is that domestic policy is internal and market policy is external. But having said that, if you look at it critically, two of them, the question is which one is more crucial in unlocking new trade opportunities? For me, I think they are not mutually exclusive, they are interconnected, and they work together. So domestic policy lays the foundation for market access. And market access, allows businesses to thrive. Now, domestic policies looks at protectionism. They are looking at, for most countries, they are looking at how do they protect their domestic industries? How do they prevent dumping? How do they review and streamline their processes and structures to provide the enabling environment where their industries can thrive and businesses can grow and the economies grow? But in putting up those restrictions, quotas, embargoes, and taxes, it brings restrictions that hinder trade. But what I will say is that both of them are critical, are together. They are like Siamese twins. You can't do one without the other. And as such, domestic policies lays the foundation. Let's take, for instance, and think about it. If you do not have products and services, or the domestic environment does not provide for good environment for production, even if there's market access, there's not going to be any trade. And even when you have market access, good market access, and there are no products, there won't be any trade, so they are complementary. So the call to action is for everyone here, every country, to go back and develop their policies to align, to make sure that it breaks the barriers of market access. And when we're talking about domestic policies, I would like to speak not just on agricultural products. We need to look at services. Services is the next, is the future. Digital is the future. Majority of the times when we look at export, the mind has been configured most of the time to go to products and probably services. But we forget that, but we forget that services, in most countries, services contribute more than agricultural products in terms of GDP. So we can't ignore it. And when you're talking about services and looking at domestic policies, we should not forget digital trade. Digital trade is very important. Like they will say, trade is the solution and digital is the future. So, and when we're looking at domestic policies, we should not forget the SMEs, the MSMEs, the women, the youth. These are the building blocks of any country. I dare say that maybe I'm a woman. If you train a woman, you train the whole community. And if you train the whole community, you train the nation. So whatever we're doing in terms of domestic policy we shouldn't discountenance women and youth for sustainable growth, and also people with special needs. So having said that, for us to be able to unlock the potentials, the new trade potentials, two of them, domestic policy and market, policies and market access should work together. So every country should go back and develop their policies to align with global trends, develop their policies to provide an enabling environment that will allow the industries to thrive and for goods and services to be produced in a manner and quality that will meet the standard. And then also market access restrictions should be removed or should be dealt with or addressed so that these goods and services I believe that with this, all the economies, all the countries will begin to see improvement in trade. They'll begin to see improvement in their economies. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Noye. One of the buzzwords I'm picking from your presentation is the need for inclusion and the need for domestic policy and market access to work in tandem. We'll come back to this later on. Professor Luke, please, David, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Princess, and my thanks also to the WTO for inviting me. Like Nonya and Sumanta before me, I do see market access and domestic policy is also going hand in hand, both required to unlock trade opportunities. In the concluding chapter of my edited book on how Africa trades, one of the issues that I tried to point out was that when it comes to both external trade as well as trade within African countries, really much of the trade is done on a preferential market access basis. So market access generally is not a problem for African countries in particular in terms of having those preferential arrangements. Where the problem lies is in issues such as tariff escalation, tariff peaks. If you take the cocoa value chain, for example, that goes from cocoa to a finished product like chocolate, you do find these tariff escalation, tariff peaks, and so which are, of course, a great challenge for African countries. Then, as Donia said, there are, of course, issues relating to food safety, issues relating to standards. These to inhibit and to some extent limit the extent to which African countries could make use of the market access that they already have. However, I want to sort of nuance this a bit and to say that there are some other aspects that we don't normally think about in relation to market access that I'd like to sort of put on the table. The first is the challenge of African countries opening up their own markets in return for being granted preferential market access. I see this as problematic in the short term because in a situation where Africa as a whole accounts for only about 2.3% of global trade, with extreme asymmetry in economic structure between African countries and its leading trading partners, I think African countries really need to have a much more careful sequencing of reciprocal market access, at least for a transitional period to overcome the trade diversion that we see with basic things like pencils and toothpicks being imported and so on. And a need to enable African countries to build productive capacity, expand trade growth, and participate more meaningfully in interconnected supply chains. The second nuance I'd like to sort of bring out is that the different preferential market access schemes, whether it's everything but arms, it's economic partnership agreements, it's the GSP, the AGOA, etc. All of them, of course, have their own different eligibility criteria. They have their own different regulatory conditions and so on. And one of the challenges that this has for the African countries, which are also trying to achieve regulatory convergence through their economic integration efforts, is that trying to align to these different market access conditions does also undermine their own efforts at economic integration. So I see this also as something that we need to think about more as to how we can align these very important external market access arrangements with Africa's own internal push and drive towards integrating its markets and integrating value and supply chains. Now, when it comes to domestic policies, I think everything that has been said by my two predecessors, from inclusion to the importance of bringing down trade costs, the issues around, in the case of Africa, again, the implementation of the FCFTA, which could be given much more dynamism and so on. All the usual behind-the-border reforms, investment facilitation. No surprise that so many African countries were participating in these discussions here. Of course, the issues around trade facilitation, business environment reforms, financial policies that prioritize credit to MSMEs, you can name them. So many of these domestic policies, of course, will complement the market access aspects. The good news is there's a lot of work that is going on in African countries in all of these areas. For example, I am on the board of Trademark Africa, which is focusing on many of these issues. One last point I'll make on all of this is that I'd like to see also greater strategic coordination among the African economies, among the African countries at the AU level and also at the level of regional economic communities, because with 54 relatively small economies, the median annual GDP or the GDP of the median African country is just about $16 billion. I think African countries need to coordinate better in relation to trade negotiations, trade discussions, because I think also that it's crucial, because there's that risk of African countries being outmaneuvered in terms of getting the sort of outcomes that they would like from all these arrangements, dealing with issues like tariff escalation, tariff peaks, etc., that I've already mentioned. So I think more strategic coordination among African countries is also needed. But broadly speaking, I'm fully in agreement with what's been said so far, and I'm sure what is soon to be said by the other colleagues on the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Look, indeed, we cannot work in silos, and then there is need for strategic coordination of African economies to work towards one goal. Yes, Ms. Viviana, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you, the WTO, for the invitation, and thank you, Dr. Ngozi, for being here with us today. It means a lot for us as a panelist and also for our country. In my case, I should add that what my previous colleagues mentioned, market access and domestic policies is like a whole body that in parts they have to find the ways to work together, and they are interconnected. In the case of the Dominican Republic, I don't know how many of you know that we are a small island in the middle of the Caribbean, a jewel in the Caribbean, I may say, that is one of the fastest growing economies in the region, but as well, we became, thanks to the effort between the public sector and the private sector, the seventh economy in whole Latin America. For us, the President of the Dominican Republic, Mr. Luis Abinader, has launched a very ambitious goal, which is to double and to duplicate our GDP by 2036. So this is very ambitious, but in terms of trade, we have been able, even though that the pandemic hit us very hard, that we had all the challenges that the different countries around the world face, that we were able to increase in our trade because we already had done our homework, which was not only the creation of the infrastructure, but as well granting that access to different markets around the world. So through the different free trade agreements, we have 6 major ones. We have access to the United States, to the European Union, to the Caribbean region, granting access to 1.2 billion consumers around the world. So that represents a huge opportunity for our producers, for our exporters, but as well to attract investment into the Dominican Republic. So we have been beating record after record, not only in attracting FDI into the Dominican Republic, that is very well connected to trade, because we have different incentives and regimes in the Dominican Republic, such as the free trade zones, incentives for the touristic sector, which increase a lot the potential of services. And as well, we have been able to create great connectivity. In example, we have very good access to 28 of the 33 Caribbean islands. So that's a market that is very close to the Dominican Republic. In the last years, we have developed and implemented different policies that can benefit us in terms of the region, because we launched the national plan to promote exports. We launched a national strategy to increase our capabilities in creating modern services and to export more. We created, this is very recent, our national strategy to benefit from the artificial intelligence, and that includes different chapters related to trade, but to access and to warranty access to women to developing these kind of capabilities. As well, we have another types of strategies that complement all the work that we have been doing. So, an example, in 2023, which was one of the best years in terms of exports in the Dominican Republic, we increased the participation in 64 different markets around the world. And not necessarily with these countries that we already have signed different free trade agreements or we have preferential access, but as well for the facilitation process that we have in place in the Dominican Republic. So we have developed a whole set of tools to take advantage of the digital economy. In Pro Dominicana, in example, we have a platform that is called Pro Inteligencia, which has data free in terms of access to a data market, connectivity in terms of connecting buyers with our local producers and exporters. We have developed specific programs to increase the participation of women in international trade. So in December, we're gonna launch the 5th edition of that study. Because if we don't measure the actions that we are taking, we cannot create new policies towards the challenges that we have. In terms of finance, it is important to say that for entrepreneurs, which is one of the difficult topics in our region, we have developed not only specific funds for women. Right now, most of the major banks in Dominican Republic has specific programs for entrepreneurs and for women that lead new kind of business. It's not important if it's if it's service or goods. So I think that the important thing is first to work together with the private sector, to hear their needs, and to work jointly to face the different challenges. That has been a key issue for the Dominican Republic. And also to monitor and doing a benchmark process on a frequent basis of the different policies that we are implementing, and to work towards granting access and working in different free trade agreements. We have detected different possibilities, in example with Asia or Africa and South America. And I think it's a constant process of rethinking all the things that we have been doing in the past, but all the things that we can do to unlock the opportunities in the future for better trade. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Viviana. I take note of the importance of consulting the stakeholders, consulting the businesses in you formulating your policies, and I see that growth and services that we'll come back and talk to later on. Tanya, if you could go through.
Nā koe, Princess, o tira tēnā tātou. Tuatahi kei te mihi atu au ki nā atua, nā rātou nei, nā mea katoa. Anō hoki ki tēnei whare whakaruru hau i a tātou, tū mai rā, tū mai rā. Ki nā mate huhua o te wā, arā ko tō tātou āriki a kingi tū heitia pō tātou te wherowhero te tua whetū, moi mai rā, oki mai, rātou ki a rātou, te hunga mate ki te hunga mate, tātou ki a tātou, te hunga ora ki te hunga ora. Urungi i tērā kei te mihi atu ki tō tātou, puhi āriki a te wai, nā wai honu i te pō, tō tātou koe ni hau, tēnā koe. Don't worry, if you're thinking that the WTO translators were not able to translate Māori, what is going to happen for the rest of the session?
Okay.
I'm fully competent and capable in English as well.
Okay.
So it's all good.
You got us.
I am here to speak as somebody who can offer a perspective as an Indigenous person. So it's absolutely important for me to begin in accordance with my own etiquette by making the appropriate acknowledgements, which is what I did. So thank you for your attention during that time. And I'd also like to thank, as my panelists have done before me, the WTO Director General and your amazing team, particularly Javier, for inviting not only myself on this panel and of course on your civil advisory group, which is an absolute honour, but the multiplicity of diverse and inclusive voices throughout the entirety of the Public Forum week. So my special thank you to you all. I'd also like to acknowledge, before proceeding, our New Zealand delegation, in particular the Honourable former Minister for Trade, Damien O'Connor, who is here present in the room. Our New Zealand head of the permanent mission to the WTO, Ambassador Claire Kelly and her team. And a special thank you to two members of the New Zealand Māori delegation, Tangi Moe Clay and Linda Munn, artists and entrepreneurs who have joined the forum this year to exhibit in the Indigenous experience space, which if you haven't already been to, I encourage you to visit, which is at the back of the atrium, and whose taonga or cultural works I'm proud to be wearing today. So also I think I've done my bit in my introduction for acknowledging, importantly, Te Wiki o Te Reo Māori, which begins tomorrow in Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's 1 week in our year where we can celebrate our cultural endurance, our tino rangatiratanga o self-determination through our language, And exactly 52 years since Te Pētihana Reo Māori, the Māori language position, was presented to the steps of Parliament in 1972, the theme of which is, this year is Ake Ake Ake, our language forever, in recognition of our movement for enduring self-determination, which applies not only to our language, also to our culture and our values as expressed through our theme today, trade and holistic development. So trade and diplomacy is and has always been integral to self-determination for Māori. And before I continue, I want to say that I do agree with my panelists around the question of market access and domestic policy. So that's the first point, but I want to explain why from an Indigenous perspective. Trade and diplomacy has always been integral to our way of being as Māori. We have whakatauki, or ancient proverbs, that celebrate and sing into the importance of development for holistic well-being, one of which is from my own tribe, the Tūhoi Whakatauki, mā te huruhuru te manu karere, a bird needs feathers to fly, highlighting that we can't achieve our development goals without the necessary resources and the necessary infrastructure to do so. In the context of questions surrounding the ongoing relevance of globalization and multilateralism, I'm guided by the words of our late Māori king, who sadly recently passed, Kingi tuheitia pōtatau te whero te tuawhetu, where he said as recently as 3 weeks ago, on the 22nd of August in his last public address, that kotahitanga and unity or collective action to the challenges which we are facing is the answer. He said, and I quote, "Let's keep pushing forward. Whilst we are currently facing a storm, there's no need to worry. In this storm, we are strong together. The wind in our sails is kotahitanga or unity, and with that, we will reach our destination." Kotahitanga as a concept shouldn't be focused on fighting externalities and that which we disagree on and that which divides us. Instead, we focus on getting in the boat, the waka, together, and working together towards our destination. And in particular, King Tuheitia reminded us that the waka is one within which we must make space for others. Even from the words of our king, you can see that Māori values require us to be relationship builders, and this is in our bloodline. Our ancestors had a practice of carving out pathways over ara whenua, over mountain ranges, over riverways and oceans, to connect people to each other and to the world for the purpose of advancement and for the purpose of diplomacy and trade. From upon these pathways embedded in the environment and on the waterways, you can actually sense the goings-on of the world around you, and you can actually feel whether you're on the right track. At times within the WTO, yes, we can sense and feel that something's not quite right. There's an undercurrent, particularly from Indigenous communities, of mistrust in systems of global economic development, which have not allowed everyone to rise together on the same tide and have brought us to a position where 82% of the world's wealth is held in the hands of only 1% of the global population. Yet the debate on whether market access or domestic policies are most critical to unlock new trade opportunities, in my view, is also not quite right either. Although the empirical data proves that policies which promote a blanket approach to distinct communities with differing needs are not the best way to ensure that the benefits of trade are distributed equally, history has shown that these policies which foster inequality can be both market access policies and domestic policies. So we need both, but neither of them are quite right for us right now either.
If
From
you
a
could,
Māori
Tanya,
perspective, we'd be
if you
better
could please
placed
sum
to
up.
shift the focus.
If you could please wrap up. I would appreciate if you could please wrap up so that we're running out of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Princess. To shift the focus from either to and. We need, in my view, sophisticated measures catering to the needs of our communities to truly enable equitable outcomes as opposed to just equitable opportunities. We need the full suite of tools at our fingertips. They need to be malleable, they need to be creative, they need to be flexible, responsive. Most of all, they need to be brave and forward-focused. I have more to say, but I will say that in a second, answering the
All right.
second question. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. All right. Thank you so much for your intervention. I was looking at time. We're running behind time. And I would love to thank you so much for your interventions. And I'm going to ask you a few questions, just one question each before we open up the floor to the audience, time permitting. But I want to start with you, Sumantha, that Dr. Ngozi highlighted when we were launching the World Trade report, that protectionism is not a cost-effective approach to achieve inclusiveness. However, we do note that India's dynamic trade environment has a blend of protectionist policies and evolving trade agreements and initiatives to enhance its exports. Now, using these simultaneously, how does India strike a right balance to maximize new trade opportunities and refine domestic policies to enhance global competitiveness of Indian industries? In like 2 minutes, just to give us your view.
Well, thanks, Princess. Well, first on a lighter tone, I think if you replace the words India with virtually most countries in the globe, it would still be relevant in some way or the other, given the paradigm that I laid out. It is true that there is a mix of both. And you can call it protectionism, you can call it domestic imperative, you can call it what you like. But the fact is that in different ways, these are a mix. Now, how does India get to the right balance?
Yes.
And let me take a few examples. First and foremost is domestic competitiveness.
Yes.
If you do not improve domestic competitiveness, neither the domestic economy or the market access is going to be effective. So the first, and there are 3 or 4 tenets of this, since lack of time, the very obvious. One, of course, is the ease of doing business.
Yes.
And the whole process of digitalization of trade, digitalization of public interface, simplification and e-interface of all licensing compliance processes.
Yes.
That's one. Second is, of course, logistics and infrastructure. And here we have a national logistics policy. You have a host of supporting policies to ensure that in terms of turnaround time and costs of trade, these are drastically reduced. Third, given the importance of digitalization of the economy, you have an innovation, which is, I'll just mention, the Open Network for Digital Commerce, or ONDC, which is an open access platform which would enable even small retail sellers to sell their products, given that very often there are internal within the system market access barriers for small players vis-a-vis the bigger players. On the other side, is equally important that you look at investments. And as I said, trade and investment today are integral. And therefore, foreign direct investment to set up, help local production, scale up local production, bring technology, and then use that to also as an export hub. And this has happened in several sectors. I think the success of the Indian auto sector and recently the Apple iPhones, incidentally the Apple iPhone 16 is being assembled and it'll be laid out from India. And this is a unique example where FDI has also been used to, in some sense, achieve both purposes. And exports were $10 billion in the last financial year. The other is in terms of market access. Of course, you have a mix. You have conventional trade agreements with goods, services, investments. You have the newer type of trade agreements which realm into a lot of new areas, digital trade, sustainable development, etc. But let me just take a few examples to indicate, one, while tariffs certainly, and I think Professor Luke mentioned that in some cases there are tariff escalation, tariff peaks, and so on. But the more important part is to address through market access the non-tariff issues in goods, and of course the regulatory issues in services. And one of the options, for example, we all know the strength of pharmaceuticals in India. And in most of our trade agreements that we are now doing, we are including what is called a pharma annex, which in simple terms makes regulatory approvals from each side much simpler, faster, and time-bound. In case of services, again, it's not just important to get your commitments, it's far more important also to get your regulatory. So now increasingly, in India's FTAs, again, let me take a few examples. We all know that domestic regulations are so important, and a large number of services, including professional services, need these disciplines for licensing, for qualification, certification, recognition, and so on. And therefore, you have provisions which actually deal directly with these in terms of either an annex or in terms of disciplines which allow temporary licensing for practice, and so on. A third area which is increasingly important is a lot of students go abroad and actually move from country to country, and they also seek work. So can these be used to actually combine the study and the work visas, which in the case of Australia has been done, and so on. So you need both innovative approach in terms of how you look at market access, and you need to look also at the domestic support that helps you. And therefore, again, I come to the same conclusion. We are trying to get this balance right so that both the domestic imperative, and someone talked of inclusivity, and in a country of India's size, that is a huge challenge in itself. And therefore, all of this with that eye of inclusivity.
All right, thank you so much, Sumantha, for your detailed explanation. Now shifting the gears a bit, Nonya, in light of the crisis and geopolitical tensions that have exposed vulnerabilities to export shocks in globally integrated markets, especially the commodity exporting countries, what policies has Nigeria, maybe one or two, done or implemented to successfully support the integration of small and medium enterprises, especially in the non-oil sector, into international markets?
Okay, thank you once again, Princess, for your question. Indeed, we all know there's been crisis and different geopolitical tensions from COVID that caused a lot of disruptions, then Russian-Ukrainian war that affected supply chain and also increased global prices of commodities, quite a number of them. But I believe that in the heat of challenges, there are opportunities. If there are no challenges, we will just be docile, we can't think. So based on that, Nigeria has come up with some initiatives. I will not be able to enumerate, but I will speak to, because of time, I'll speak to some few ones.
Okay.
Those innovative policies and initiatives that also have helped us to be able to play actively in the global market. Now, the first one I'll speak to is the PEBEC, Presidential Enabling Business Committee. This actually set up to, is constituted by 24 MDAs, ministry, departments, and agencies, just to see how we can improve the ease of doing business. So first of all, to make it easy for the MSMEs and the corporations to be able to do business easily, it cuts across from automation to easy registration process, to how to also bring in private sector to the business, especially the MSMEs, because the MSMEs, the SMEs are in Nigeria, about 96% of businesses are made up of SMEs. So how can we provide an enabling environment for them to thrive, to do business, and for them to also be able to do transactions and export? Then I also speak about digital, the digital strategy, digital policy and strategy for 2020 to 2030. We all said digital is the future. So Nigeria recognized that. And they have come up with, based on that policy, there are initiatives that border on capacity building from capacity building in different segments, teaching there's e-commerce. And I also like to talk about with this, you know, COVID also opened our eyes. You see, during COVID, some women, some businesses that could not even sell within their vicinity have been able to export, export through e-commerce. They've been able to open their products and services to the global market. So that's digital strategy is also supposed to make Nigerians also key in to digital economy, and we're doing that. And we're training the youth, training the women, and every MSA. And then again, there is what we call the MSME clinic, which is driven particularly by the vice president of the country. And you see them establishing different hubs, fashion hubs, tech hubs. These are supposed to galvanize all the youths and the women and MSME. These are initiatives. And then I shouldn't forget, I'm sorry you said to, I
Yes,
shouldn't
please.
forget about trade facilitation.
Yes.
Trade facilitation there are a lot of initiatives, and incidentally it sits within my parent ministry and is anchored by, also by my minister, the Honorable Minister of Industry, Trade and Investment. And under that, there are so many projects. We just launched the Lily Port. It's a port dedicated specifically for export, to help MSMEs to break the logistic issues, the cumbersome custom procedures and documentation. So that Lily Port is just for export. And then, of course, the due to reduce the logistic challenges. But please, let me stop, let me not end without talking about the collaboration and partnership with WTO on she trade. That is a very powerful initiative that has changed a lot of women in the country, and a lot of initiatives are around that. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much, Nonye, for your intervention. David, look, according to the Economic for Africa report, African traders, countries get to trade more outside the continent than amongst themselves, with intra-Africa trade accounting for only 15%. And this is compared to 60% trade in Asia, 70% in Europe. What factors, if you could mention at least two, are preventing African countries from trading more with each other? Thank you.
Thanks again, Princess. This question too, forgive me, but let me give you a more nuanced answer. No, yes, indeed, this Economic Commission for Africa report that you mentioned gives these figures. But when you look at intra-African trade, it is small, that is true, but much more diversified. About 45% of the products traded within Africa actually manufactures, processed foodstuffs and so on. And then when you also bring in informal intra-African trade into the picture, you find that, and again, I've been involved in research that shows anything between 17 and 38% of informal, of trade between contiguous African countries. Informal trade accounts for anything between 17 and 38% of trade between contiguous African countries. Now, the challenge, of course, is to formalize intra-African trade, and that is why initiatives like the African Continental Free Trade Area is important. This, of course, is an agreement that covers not only goods, but services. Services has been mentioned in this discussion here. It also covers digital trade and several other areas. Implementation of that agreement, full implementation of it is, of course, important to bring out the benefits, and the benefits are well known by now. There's very good modeling work that has been carried out by the major international organizations that show that this could, implementation of the agreement could boost intra-African trade. You've seen the figures, I'm sure, yourself as a senior economist at the Central Bank of Botswana, but by 2035, for example, if I could cite the World Bank modeling, you could see intra-African trade increasing, I think, by up to 25%.
Yes.
Also, if these implementation is accompanied by intense efforts at trade facilitation, which has been mentioned, bringing down the cost of trade, the customs reforms and so on. The benefits could even be more. And all of this modeling is showing that there could be substantial boosts to manufacturers, to services as well. So yes, intra-African trade is small compared to other regions, but the tools are there. What I think the challenge that we face is to make sure that we implement the tools that we have agreed on. So I think this is the much more nuanced answer I can give you to that question. And I know you want me to be brief because I can see from your,
Yeah. All right.
I can see that you're signaling not to go on too long. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. I guess we highlight the importance of not only designing policies, but also implementing these policies so that we are able to achieve trade, we are able to include more economies, and also diversification from what you're saying. I understand diversification and the importance of that to be able to achieve this projection by World Bank. All right. Thank you so much. Viviana, in a world, like you had said, how you acknowledge digitalization earlier in your presentation, and we're in a world where technological advancements are inevitable. They're continuously shaping the way countries unlock trade opportunities. How has digitalization contributed to expanding new markets in your economy? One reason or two, please, be short.
Thank you very much for this question. First of all, in Dominican Republic,
Yes.
we are embracing technology to unlock business opportunities. In the case of Pro Dominicana, which is the Center for the Promotion of Export and Investment of the Dominican Republic, what we have created is a digital ecosystem to connect businesses, international buyers, as I just mentioned, but as well to provide access to different databases to grant the possibility to raise up new alerts, new possibilities of trade, challenges that may be facing in one market. And that platform is being accessed not only by Dominican users. Right now it's being used from people from France, China, Ireland, and other countries. But as well, I think one important thing is to mention that 20 years ago, we created the national strategy to embrace the information society. But we saw that it was not until the pandemic hit us very hard that we had to speed and accelerate different processes of teleeducation, telemedicine, e-commerce. So I think, and the projections of e-commerce in the Dominican Republic has been increasing a lot. It will mean more than $1.4 billion in terms of new businesses. But what we have been doing is to create universal access. So businesses, it doesn't matter the size of the business, especially small and medium and enterprises can be in the digital economy. Jointly with that, we have created the strategy of modern services. So with different combinations of programs, we have been granting access and to facilitate the different opportunities that the government has. But as well, it's very important to mention that in the case of the Dominican Republic, since the first mandate of President Abinader, we launched a program that is called Zero Bureaucracy, which means that every institution in the whole government ecosystem has to be focused on facilitation. So a part of the initiatives related to trade is that we are dispatching merchandises that arrives to the Dominican ports in 24 hours, the whole week. We have implemented the one-stop shop for investment. We have improved one initiative that we had in place, which is the one-stop shop for trade. So what we are doing is granting access to the people in the different territories of the Dominican Republic, because is not balanced. There is a lot of asymmetries, trying to close the different gaps that we have in our country and trying to create new opportunities to access trade as a mechanism to create wealth in the different communities around our country. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much. Indeed, so many innovations that you're doing in your country, and the importance of closing gaps. That to me speaks that you are able to sit down as countries, see where you are failing, see where you are having challenges, and be able to address that to improve trade. Now, Tanya, you had spoken of how you work with the indigenous groups or the communities. You want to engage them in trade and offer them new opportunities. Could you please share with us an insight, one or two, and please be brief because we've run out of time, on how New Zealand has successfully promoted greater participation of your indigenous people in international trade? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Princess. I can give one very innovative example that is really having positive impact, and that is a partnered approach of our Ministry for Foreign Affairs and Trade with Māori to approach free trade instruments. And in particular, Te Taumata, our Māori Trade Advisory Board, which I'm the Deputy Chair of, and a number of other Māori partnering bodies, all established under the leadership of our former Trade Minister, who is here, Honourable Damien O'Connor. So one of the most important examples that I'd like to share is the groundbreaking, comprehensive chapter for Māori trade and cooperation, which have been achieved in both first of all, the New Zealand-UK FTA, and then following that, the New Zealand-EU FTA. The negotiator, one of the negotiators for which is also present here, and Māori himself, Tāne Waitford. The whole model, I don't have very much time, I know, to express the sophistication of the model. Believe me, these were big gains that were hard fought for, and they were hard fought for by all players involved, not excluding the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade and our negotiation team, but also the Māori partners, such as Te Taumata, my board. They are, as I mentioned, world-leading, comprehensive trade chapters, and as a result of, now we're seeing a new focus, which my Te Taumata Māori Trade Board is heavily involved in, which is to ensure that the benefits, that we're not just negotiating these opportunities, but that the benefits are not being implemented. We are now focused on, since they've both come into force, the second phase, which is ensuring that Māori exporters know about the benefits that flow from these chapters and are encouraged to access them. There is an issue in New Zealand which is often referred to as the spaghetti bowl effect, where there's a number of different free market access benefits that are available to exporters, which exporters simply may not know about, or they're confused by, or they're using one which doesn't give them most benefits, and not using the one which gives the most benefits. It's a complex and complicated system to navigate, and anyone who is an exporter will know exactly what I'm talking about. So partnering boards like mine, again Te Taumata, are working directly with Māori communities and exporters and entrepreneurs to ensure that they can access the benefits that flow from those free trade agreements. And just one final plug, in the short time available to us, one example is a close relationship that the Māori Trade Board, my Māori Trade Board Te Taumata, has developed with the French Embassy in New Zealand to establish an implementation plan as a direct flow on from the EU FTA to hear from Māori what we would like to see flow out of that chapter, and then to see how we can collaborate together to realise that. And the French Embassy implementation plan is a precedent and is going to be a first of its kind in its own right. So I think I'll leave it there.
All right. All right. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we've run behind time, and others will be going for their panels. I won't be able to take any questions from the floor. But I would like to thank you so much for your insights. Thank you so much for your time and sharing the knowledge that you have. And because we're not able to take questions, I would love us to reflect deeply on the insights that we have shared here, think critically on how we can improve trade and create new opportunities for all our countries in different areas, especially the least and developing countries. So I'd like to thank you so much for taking your time, for being part of this panel and having shared your insights, and thank my audience for having listened and being a good audience. Thank you so much.